Robert and Margaret Bennett had been yearning for a new beginning, and the residence on Willowbrook Drive appeared to be the ideal place to achieve it. Nestled in a serene suburban enclave, the two-story house provided everything they had been seeking: ample space, seclusion, and a sense of permanence. The true gem of the property was the expansive backyard, a verdant expanse bordered by majestic oak and maple trees that offered both shade and peace. Margaret, a devoted horticulturist and lecturer at the nearby community college, immediately imagined the yard blossoming into a lively garden. Meanwhile, Robert, a seasoned financial consultant with a keen strategic mind, saw it as the perfect sanctuary away from the unyielding demands of his profession. They settled into their new home on a brisk autumn morning, transporting boxes brimming with their lives and cherished memories. This move symbolized not merely a change of address, but a profound transformation. In recent years, their strength had been severely tested by a heartbreaking personal loss that had introduced fissures into their previously unshakable partnership. However, this house, with its bright, sunlit rooms and assurances of peaceful evenings, was intended to mend those fractures. It was envisioned as their refuge, a place where they could reconstruct their lives and genuinely progress forward. From the outset, Margaret immersed herself in the transformation of the backyard. She dedicated countless hours to studying soil compositions and planting timelines, meticulously drafting plans for flower beds and vegetable gardens. Robert would often observe her from the kitchen window as she worked the soil, her hands stained with earth, her face radiant with enthusiasm. It was the most joyful he had seen her in months, and he found comfort in the fact that this new chapter seemed beneficial for both of them. Before long, the Bennetts became aware of the Homeowners Association, or HOA. Initially, it appeared harmless, mere routine reminders in the mailbox regarding neighborhood regulations and upcoming community gatherings. Robert, ever the practical one, skimmed through the brochures and dismissed them with a shrug. Margaret, however, was less dismissive. She carefully reviewed the documents, noting some of the more unusual stipulations, such as the precise hue of beige required for mailbox paint or the monthly inspections of lawn height. "Typical suburban red tape," Robert quipped one evening as Margaret frowned over the paperwork. They both agreed to adhere to the regulations as necessary to avoid any issues, but didn't give it much further thought. Then, one morning, everything shifted. Margaret was up early, as usual, tending to her garden when she heard the low rumble of machinery. She paused, trowel in hand, and glanced toward the perimeter of the backyard. Through the morning mist, she saw a group of workers unloading supplies from a truck. At first, she assumed they might be contractors hired by a neighbor, but when one of the men began excavating near her flower beds, alarm bells rang in her mind. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, striding toward them. The workers scarcely acknowledged her, continuing to drive stakes into the ground. "What are you doing? This is private property." Her voice rose, but the men did not halt their work. One of them finally turned to face her, holding a clipboard. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his indifferent expression matching his curt response. "We're installing a safety barrier, ma'am. It's an HOA directive," he stated, as if that clarified everything. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "A safety barrier? Through my backyard? I didn't authorize this." The man shrugged, showing no interest in her objections. "You'll need to discuss this with the HOA. We're merely following orders," he added. By the time Robert came outside to assess the situation, the workers had already unfurled several feet of heavy industrial-grade fencing. The sight of thick black wire adorned with sharp barbs stretching across their yard filled him with a deep-seated anger. He approached the man with the clipboard, demanding explanations, but received the same dismissive reply: "Talk to the HOA." Robert was not one to shy away from a confrontation. He insisted the workers cease immediately, threatening legal action if they did not comply. The foreman gave him a cautious look before signaling his crew to pause. "You've got until the end of the day to resolve this," he informed before returning to his truck. Margaret, still unsettled, turned to Robert. "What on earth is happening? They can't just come in and do this, can they?" "They can't," Robert responded, his jaw clenched, "but we're going to uncover the reason behind it." The couple promptly contacted the HOA office, but their efforts to obtain a clear answer were met with vague reassurances and evasive responses. The receptionist, a woman with a brisk demeanor, informed them that the fence was part of a new community safety initiative intended to protect residents from unspecified dangers. When Robert sought further details, she advised him to raise his concerns at the next HOA meeting, scheduled for the following week. Until then, I recommend you refrain from interfering with the installation, she added sharply before ending the call. The Bennetts were left with more uncertainties than answers. That evening, they stood in their backyard, gazing at the partially constructed fence that now disrupted their once immaculate view. The industrial spikes gleamed ominously in the twilight, a stark contrast to the gentle greens and yellows of Margaret's garden. The fence was not merely an eyesore. It was an intrusion, a breach of the peace they had diligently worked to establish. "This doesn't feel right," Margaret murmured softly, her arms tightly crossed against the evening chill. "It's not just about safety. There's something more to this." Robert nodded, his mind racing with possible explanations. He had always been adept at discerning patterns and connections where others saw only random elements. Something about this situation was inconsistent. Why was the HOA so secretive about the project? Why hadn't they been notified in advance? And what kind of safety concern could possibly warrant cutting through private property without consent? The following morning, Margaret made another unsettling discovery that deepened the mystery. As she examined the section of the fence nearest to her garden, she noticed a small, engraved emblem near the base of one of the posts. It wasn't the HOA's logo. It belonged to a private security firm. She took a photograph and showed it to Robert. "Does this look like something a neighborhood association would use?" she inquired. Robert frowned thoughtfully. "No, this is high-end equipment. Someone is investing significant resources into this." Their peaceful suburban existence had been disrupted, and the Bennetts were determined to uncover the truth. Unbeknownst to them, this was merely the beginning of a much larger struggle, one that would test their determination, intellect, and unity as a couple. Robert did not hesitate. The moment he saw the fencing crew return the next morning to continue their work, he grabbed his phone and began making calls. Unsure whom to contact first, his instincts directed him to start at the top. He called the main office again, bypassing the general line, and requested to speak directly with the association's president. After an interminable hold, a calm yet detached voice finally answered. "This is Eleanor Thompson, HOA president. How may I assist you?" "Miss Thompson, this is Robert Bennett. I reside at 237 Willowbrook Drive. Can you explain why there's a barbed wire fence being erected across my backyard? I was informed this is an HOA project, yet I received no prior notification, no explanation, nothing." There was a brief silence on the other end before Eleanor responded. "Mr. Bennett, the fence is part of a community safety initiative recently approved by the HOA board. It's intended to address certain concerns within the neighborhood and ensure the safety of all residents." Robert's frustration was evident. "What specific concerns? And why does this involve trespassing on private property without permission? This is my backyard, and I did not consent to any of this." Eleanor maintained her unnervingly calm tone. "The safety measures are part of a broader plan outlined in the last HOA meeting. Notices were sent to all residents." "I didn't receive any notice," Robert retorted sharply. "Even if I had, I would never have agreed to something like this. What kind of safety issue are we even discussing?" "I'm afraid I cannot disclose the specifics at this time," Eleanor replied. "The details of the initiative are confidential." Robert's frustration reached its peak. "Confidential? This isn't a military operation. It's a suburban neighborhood. You can't simply seize private property under the guise of safety without providing homeowners with clear information." Eleanor's voice remained disturbingly composed. "Mr. Bennett, the HOA operates under the authority granted by the community charter. All decisions made by the board are legally binding. If you have concerns, I suggest you attend the next HOA meeting where we can discuss this further." Before Robert could argue further, the line went dead. He stared at his phone in disbelief, a whirlwind of anger and confusion swirling in his mind. The phrases legally binding and confidential echoed in his thoughts, raising more questions than answers. He returned to the backyard, where Margaret was standing near the half-installed fence, her arms crossed and a deep crease of worry etched on her forehead. "What did they say?" she asked. "Not much," Robert replied tersely. "Apparently this is part of some safety initiative, and they claim it was approved at a meeting we weren't even informed about. Eleanor Thompson says it's legally binding." "Legally binding," Margaret repeated, her voice growing louder. "They can't just declare parts of our yard off limits. That's not how property ownership works." "Exactly what I told her," Robert responded, running a hand through his hair. "But she wouldn't provide any details. She just told me to bring it up at the next HOA meeting." Margaret glanced back at the fence, her unease intensifying. "Robert, this doesn't feel right. What kind of safety issue would require barbed wire and industrial fencing? This isn't just about keeping deer out of the garden." "I know," Robert agreed. "And that's what bothers me. If it were something simple, they wouldn't be so secretive about it." Later that day, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. While Robert was at work, she began researching the HOA and its recent activities. She started with their website, but the information was sparse and uninformative, merely generic updates about neighborhood events and maintenance schedules. Frustrated, she delved deeper, searching for news articles or public records that might illuminate the association's recent projects. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon something intriguing. An article from a few months prior mentioned a collaboration between the HOA and a private security firm named Sentinel Protective Services. According to the piece, Sentinel had been contracted to implement advanced security measures in the area, though the specifics were not disclosed. Margaret's brow furrowed as she navigated to the firm's website. Sentinel's services included high-tech surveillance systems, perimeter fencing, and crowd control solutions. The site's promotional material featured stern language about neutralizing threats and maintaining order, which seemed highly inappropriate for a suburban neighborhood. She called Robert as soon as she could, her voice urgent. "Robert, I think I've found something. The HOA is working with a security company called Sentinel Protective Services. Their website makes them sound like they belong on a military base, not here." "Sentinel Protective Services?" Robert echoed, his tone skeptical. "What are they doing in a place like this?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but it explains the fence. This isn't something the HOA would install on their own. Sentinel must be involved." "Great," Robert muttered, frustration evident in his voice. "So now we're dealing with a private security firm on top of the HOA. This just keeps getting worse." That evening, the Bennetts decided to address the situation directly. They visited their nearest neighbor, a retired couple named the Harrisons, to inquire if they knew anything about the fence. The Harrisons were courteous but visibly uneasy, frequently glancing over their shoulders as if they were being watched. "We heard about the safety initiative," Mr. Harrison said hesitantly. "The HOA said it was for the good of the community, but we didn't ask many questions." "Why not?" Robert pressed. Mrs. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't want any trouble. The last time someone opposed the HOA, their property taxes mysteriously increased, and they received a slew of violations. It's not worth the fight." Robert and Margaret exchanged a concerned look, their unease deepening. As they walked back to their home, Margaret murmured, "This isn't just about fences. They're using fear to keep everyone in line." Robert nodded solemnly. "And if that's how they operate, we're going to need a plan, a good one." That night, Margaret decided to investigate further. She meticulously reviewed local property records and zoning maps, searching for any clues about the HOA's true intentions. Meanwhile, Robert reached out to his network of colleagues and acquaintances, hoping someone might have encountered similar situations. By the time they retired for the night, both were on edge. The fence was no longer just an eyesore. It was a symbol of something far more sinister. As Robert lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that their tranquil suburban life was about to be profoundly disrupted. Neither of them could have anticipated just how accurate his instincts were. The workers returned at dawn, their truck rumbling loudly as it pulled into the cul-de-sac. Margaret had been up for hours, gazing out the window with a mixture of frustration and apprehension. She had spent the night reviewing every piece of paperwork she and Robert had signed when they purchased the house. There was no indication that the HOA had the authority to alter their property or install something as invasive as the barbed wire fence currently slicing through their backyard. Yet here they were again, continuing their work as if nothing had happened. Robert emerged from the bedroom, bleary-eyed but determined. He had scarcely slept, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "They're here already," he observed, glancing out the window. "Bright and early," Margaret muttered. "They don't waste any time, do they?" Robert grabbed his coat and headed for the backyard. "I'm going to talk to them again." Margaret followed, her resolve evident. "I'm coming with you." As they approached the workers, Robert raised his voice to gain their attention. "Hey, I thought I told you yesterday to stop until we figure this out." The foreman, the same burly man with the clipboard from the previous day, turned around with an exasperated expression. "We have a schedule to maintain," he replied flatly. "Take it up with the HOA." "We did," Robert snapped, "and they didn't provide any real answers. So until we get this resolved, you're trespassing. This is private property." The foreman shrugged. "Not my decision. I've got orders and I'm following them." Robert stepped closer, his anger barely contained. "You can't just show up and do whatever you please. If you're not off this property within the next 10 minutes, I'm calling the police." The foreman remained unfazed. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "Do you see this?" he said, holding it up. "It's a work order, signed and stamped by the HOA. As far as I'm concerned, we're authorized to be here. If you have a problem, take it up with them. But I'm not stopping." Robert snatched the paper from his hand and examined it. The document bore the official HOA letterhead and signatures, but something about it felt off. It didn't specify the reason for the fence installation or the safety concerns it purported to address. It was vague, almost deliberately so. "This doesn't mean anything," Robert declared, crumpling the paper. "Get off my property." The foreman raised an eyebrow but remained silent. He signaled his crew to begin packing up their tools and loading them back into the truck. "We'll be back," he called over his shoulder. "This isn't over." Robert and Margaret stood in silence as the truck drove away, leaving behind the incomplete fence and a tangle of stakes and wires strewn across the lawn. "What now?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Now we dig deeper," Robert stated firmly. "If they think they can intimidate us, they're in for a surprise." The rest of the day was consumed by phone calls and research. Robert contacted a real estate attorney he knew from his younger days, explaining the situation and sending over photos of the fence and the work order. The attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Helen, assured him she would investigate and respond promptly. Meanwhile, Margaret took a more proactive approach. She grabbed her camera and walked along the length of the fence, documenting every detail. The stakes, the wiring, the peculiar emblem engraved on one of the posts, the same one she had discovered online the previous night belonging to Sentinel Protective. As she reached the far end of the fence, something caught her eye. A small, freshly dug hole near the base of one of the stakes. Inside was a bundle of wires, partially buried but still visible. Margaret knelt down for a closer inspection and realized they weren't ordinary wires. They were part of some electronic system. "Robert," she called, her voice edged with urgency. "Look at this. The fence is connected to something." Robert rushed to her side, his face pale from hours of stress. "What is this? A power source? A monitoring system?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but it's not normal, and it's definitely not just for safety." Robert took a photograph of the wires and sent it to Helen, including a message. "What kind of fence has electronics built into it?" By evening, Helen had returned with her initial findings. "You're right to be suspicious," she affirmed. That work order is legally shaky at best. The HOA doesn't have explicit authority to modify your property without your consent, even under the guise of a safety initiative. And that logo, Sentinel Protective Services, they're not just a security firm. They specialize in surveillance and perimeter control. This isn't about safety, Robert, Helen continued. It's about control. Robert's heart sank. Control of what? I'm not entirely sure yet, Helen responded, but I'm going to investigate further. In the meantime, document everything, take pictures, keep records of every interaction. If this escalates, you'll need solid evidence. That night, Robert and Margaret sat in their living room, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily upon them. The fence was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a tangible threat, embodying a larger, more insidious agenda. What are they trying to conceal? Margaret pondered aloud. Or what are they trying to keep us away from? Robert added. Around midnight, they were abruptly awakened by a loud metallic clanging. Robert grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the backyard, with Margaret close behind. The noise was emanating from the far side of the fence, where a shadowy figure was crouched near the base, working on something. "Robert!" she shouted, shining the flashlight directly at the figure. The person froze momentarily before darting into the darkness, leaving behind a small toolbox and what appeared to be a set of blueprints. Robert picked up the blueprints, his hands trembling. They were detailed schematics of the fence, complete with annotations and measurements. In the corner of the page was the Sentinel logo, along with the words, Phase 2 Implementation. What on earth is Phase 2? Margaret whispered, her voice quivering. I don't know, Robert replied, his mind racing. But whatever it is, we're going to stop it. The fence isn't just an intrusion anymore. It's a battleground, and we have no intention of losing. Robert sat at the kitchen table, the blueprint spread out before him like an unsolvable puzzle. Margaret leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the intricate diagrams. Every measurement, every label, every technical note seemed deliberately complex, designed to obscure the true purpose. Phase 2 implementation? Robert mused, breaking the silence. This isn't just a fence. It's part of something much bigger. But what could they possibly be planning that requires wiring, surveillance, and barbed wire cutting through people's backyards? Margaret questioned, frustration evident in her voice. This isn't a military base. It's a neighborhood, Robert replied without answering her question. His mind was already working, connecting dots that didn't seem to fit. The partnership with Sentinel Protective Services, the vague statements from Eleanor Thompson, the electronic components embedded in the fence, it all pointed to something more malevolent than mere community safety. Yet the complete picture remained elusive. They decided to take the blueprints to Helen, the real estate attorney Robert had contacted earlier. The next morning, they met her at her office, a modest space filled with filing cabinets and legal volumes. Helen examined the documents carefully, her sharp eyes narrowing as she traced the lines and symbols with her finger. These are not standard construction plans, she observed. Whoever designed this has considerable resources and expertise. Look here. She pointed to a cluster of symbols near the center of the blueprint. This isn't just wiring. It's a sensor grid. These are motion detectors, and if I'm reading this correctly, they're designed to feed data into a centralized system. A centralized system? Robert echoed. Yes, surveillance, Helen explained. This fence isn't just about keeping people out or in. It's about monitoring movement. Whatever Phase 2 entails, it involves real-time data collection. Margaret's face paled. Why would a neighborhood HOA need surveillance like this? Who are they watching? Helen leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. I don't believe it's solely the HOA. Sentinel Protective Services appears to be driving this initiative, using the HOA as a convenient facade. My suspicion is that someone higher up is using this neighborhood as a testing ground. For what? Robert pressed, his voice hardening. That's what we need to uncover, Helen responded. But if you're going to challenge this, you need more than just suspicions. You need undeniable proof that this fence and whatever comes next are illegal. Robert nodded, determination settling in his chest. Then we'll get it. That evening, Robert and Margaret returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. They spent hours meticulously reviewing every document they had: property deeds, HOA bylaws, meeting minutes they managed to find online. The deeper they delved, the more inconsistencies they uncovered. For one, the HOA bylaws made no mention of any authority to install structures on private property without explicit consent. Additionally, the meeting minutes from the past year contained no references to a Phase 2 initiative or any partnership with Sentinel Protective Services. It was as if the entire project had been orchestrated behind the scenes. As they worked late into the night, Margaret's phone buzzed with a message from one of her colleagues at the university, someone who specialized in environmental studies. She had sent him photos of the fence and the Sentinel logo earlier, hoping for some insight. "Margaret, this might be nothing, but I recognize the name Sentinel. They've been involved in several questionable projects lately, mostly land acquisitions disguised as security operations. I'll keep digging and let you know if I find anything else." Margaret read the message aloud, and Robert's jaw tightened. "Land acquisitions," he muttered. "So this is about money." "It always is," Margaret replied bitterly. The next day, they decided to confront Eleanor Thompson directly. They arrived at the HOA office unannounced, determined to obtain answers. The receptionist, a young woman with a strained smile, attempted to stall them, but Robert was insistent. "We're not leaving until we speak to Eleanor," he declared firmly. Reluctantly, the receptionist led them to a small conference room where Eleanor was already waiting. She sat behind a polished wooden table, her hands neatly folded in front of her. Her expression was calm, almost smug, as if she had been expecting them. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett?" she greeted smoothly. "What can I do for you?" she asked. Robert wasted no time. He placed the blueprints on the table in front of her. "You can start by explaining this." Eleanor glanced at the documents but did not appear surprised. "Where did you obtain these?" she inquired. "That's not the point," Robert snapped. "The point is that you're installing a surveillance system in people's backyards and obscuring it with vague claims about community safety. We want answers, and we want them now." Eleanor's smile did not waver. "Mr. Bennett, I understand your concerns, but you are misunderstanding the situation. This project is entirely legal and was approved by the HOA board. We've reviewed the bylaws." Margaret interjected. "There's nothing in them that grants you the authority to do this. And there's nothing in the meeting minutes about this project being approved." Eleanor's composure faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her poise. Some decisions are made at the board's discretion for the greater good of the community. Not every detail is documented in the minutes. Robert leaned forward, his voice low and stern. "Cut the nonsense, Eleanor. This isn't about safety or the greater good. It's about money. Who's paying you to let Sentinel use this neighborhood as their testing ground?" For a brief moment, something flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or anger, but she swiftly masked it with her usual calm demeanor. "Mr. Bennett, I suggest you tread carefully. Making baseless accusations could have serious consequences." "Are you threatening us?" Margaret demanded, her voice sharp. "Not at all," Eleanor replied smoothly. "I'm simply advising you to be mindful of your actions. Now, if there's nothing else, I have other matters to attend to." Robert and Margaret left the office, shaken but undeterred. They knew they were onto something, and Eleanor's evasiveness only confirmed their suspicions. That night, as they reviewed their findings, Robert's phone buzzed with an email from Helen. Attached was a public record search she had conducted on Sentinel Protective Services. Among the documents was a contract between Sentinel and a private development company. The company had plans to purchase large areas of land in suburban neighborhoods, using security concerns as a pretext to drive down property values and compel residents to sell. "This is it," Robert said, his voice grim. "They're trying to push us out." Margaret stared at the document, her fists clenched. "Over my dead body," she declared. The Bennetts had found their proof. Now they just needed to determine how to utilize it. The atmosphere in their home was thick with tension as they prepared for what seemed like the next phase of their battle. They had uncovered enough of the truth to realize the stakes were higher than they had anticipated. Sentinel Protective Services wasn't merely assisting the HOA in installing fences. They were part of a larger scheme to devalue the neighborhood, force homeowners to leave, and transfer the land to a private development company. The plan was as cold and calculated as it was infuriating, but now that they knew what was happening, Robert and Margaret were resolute in stopping it. The morning after their confrontation with Eleanor Thompson, Robert awoke to the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel. He sprang out of bed and looked out the window. A group of workers, different from the original crew, was unloading materials from a black van parked on the street. They wore dark uniforms with no visible logos, their movements swift and efficient. As Robert squinted to get a better look, one of the men glanced up at the window. Their eyes met for a split second before the man turned back to his colleagues, saying something Robert couldn't hear. "Robert?" Margaret called from the porch. "What's wrong?" he asked, approaching her. "They're back," he replied grimly, "and these guys aren't the usual crew." Margaret's face tightened with concern. "Do you think they're from Sentinel?" "Almost certainly," Robert responded. "We need to find out what they're doing." Donning a jacket, Robert headed outside, with Margaret close behind. The men initially ignored them, continuing to unpack large metal panels and cylindrical devices that resembled high-tech surveillance equipment. Robert stepped into their path, forcing one of them to stop. "What's going on here?" Robert demanded. "Why are you on my property?" The man remained silent. Up close, Robert could see that he was wearing a discreet earpiece and his expression was blank, almost robotic. Without a word, the man stepped around Robert and continued working. "Hey, Robert!" Margaret shouted, her frustration evident. "I asked you a question." One of the other men finally turned to face him. His voice was calm, but cold. "This is an authorized operation under the jurisdiction of the HOA. Please stay back." "Jurisdiction?" Robert echoed. "This is private property," Margaret interjected. "You can't just stroll in here with your equipment and start installing whatever you want." The man gave her a condescending look. "If you have complaints, take them up with your HOA representative." "We're just following orders," he stated flatly. Robert clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. "Fine, but I'm documenting everything." He pulled out his phone and began recording the scene, ensuring he captured the men, their equipment, and the van's license plate. The men didn't react, continuing their work as though he wasn't present. Margaret followed suit, snapping photos of the devices they were unloading. After about 20 minutes, the van pulled away, leaving the equipment neatly piled in the backyard. Robert and Margaret inspected the materials, most of which were unfamiliar, advanced-looking gadgets with no obvious markings or instructions. "What do you think this is?" Margaret asked, crouching to examine one of the cylindrical devices. "I don't know," Robert admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not just a fence. This looks like surveillance or maybe even some kind of signal jammer." "Signal jammer? Why would they need something like that?" "To keep us isolated," Robert replied grimly. "If they can disrupt communications, it'll be harder for us to get help." Later that day, Robert received a call from Helen. He briefed her on the latest developments, including the new crew and their mysterious equipment. Helen's tone was urgent. "This is escalating quickly," she said. "I've been investigating Sentinel's operations, and it's worse than I thought. They've done this in other neighborhoods, using intimidation and harassment to force people out. Some homeowners have reported break-ins, property damage, even physical confrontations." "Sounds about right," Robert muttered. "What can we do to stop them?" "You need to file a formal complaint with the city," Helen advised. "If Sentinel is operating without proper permits, that's a violation. And keep documenting everything. They'll try to intimidate you. But the more evidence you have, the stronger your case will be." Robert thanked her and hung up, but the conversation left him uneasy. The notion that Sentinel might escalate their tactics wasn't surprising, but it was still unnerving. He shared Helen's warning with Margaret, and they agreed to take extra precautions. That evening, they installed additional locks on their doors and set up motion-activated cameras around the property. They also backed up all their evidence, photos, videos, emails, to a secure cloud storage account. Despite their preparations, the tension remained palpable. Every noise outside, every shadow in the yard heightened their anxiety. They were waging a battle on their own land, but the opposition felt perpetually one step ahead. The next confrontation occurred 2 days later. Robert was returning home from a meeting with Helen when he noticed a black SUV parked across the street from their house. It hadn't been there that morning, and something about it felt unsettling. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, and the engine was idling quietly. As Robert pulled into the driveway, the SUV remained stationary. He watched it in his rearview mirror, half expecting someone to exit the vehicle, but no one did. When he exited his car, he stood for a moment, staring at the vehicle. It seemed to watch him back, a silent, mechanical presence. "Robert?" Margaret called from the porch. "What's wrong?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just keep an eye on that SUV. I'll be inside in a minute." But as he turned toward the house, the SUV's engine roared to life, speeding down the street and disappearing around the corner before Robert could react. That night, Margaret found another envelope in their mailbox. There was no return address, just their names scrawled in blocky, uneven handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Stop interfering or you'll regret it." Robert's face hardened as he read the note. "They're trying to scare us," he stated firmly. "It's not going to work." But Margaret's hands trembled. "Robert, what if they're serious? What if they—" "They won't," Robert interrupted resolutely, "because we're not backing down." The fear was real, but so was their determination. The Bennetts knew they were facing a powerful, ruthless adversary, but they also understood they couldn't afford to capitulate. This wasn't just about their backyard anymore. It was about standing up to corruption, greed, and intimidation. As Robert gazed at the empty street outside, he made a silent vow. No matter how far Sentinel and the HOA were willing to go, he and Margaret would go further. They would fight, and they would prevail. Robert paced the living room, the envelope with the threat still resting on the coffee table. Margaret sat nearby, her laptop open as she reviewed the stack of evidence they had collected. Photos of the fence, videos of the workers, notes from Helen, and even the blueprint bearing Sentinel's logo. The pieces were all there, but they still needed one final move to tip the scales. "They're escalating," Robert muttered. "First the fence, now the surveillance equipment. And now this," he said, gesturing toward the envelope. "They're trying to intimidate us into backing down." Margaret didn't look up from her screen. If they're going this far, it means we're close to something significant. They wouldn't bother with threats if we weren't a problem for them. Robert stopped pacing and turned to her. "So, what's the next step? We can't just sit here and wait for them to make the next move." "I think it's time to go public," Margaret stated, her tone resolute. "If the HOA won't listen and Sentinel is operating in the shadows, we need to bring this into the light. Expose them for what they're doing." Robert frowned thoughtfully. "That's risky. If we go public, they'll likely double down. We don't know how far they're willing to go to protect their interests, and we don't know how far they'll go if we remain silent." Margaret countered, "This isn't just about us anymore. If they're targeting this neighborhood, they'll do the same to others. Someone has to stand up to them." Robert sighed, recognizing the truth in her words. "You're right. It wasn't in my nature to take such a bold public stance. But we have no other options." "All right," he agreed. "We'll do it. But if we're going to fight them head-on, we need to be smart about it. No mistakes." They spent the next few hours preparing. Margaret compiled their evidence into a cohesive narrative, outlining how Sentinel and the HOA were collaborating to install surveillance equipment under the guise of community safety. Robert reached out to Helen, who agreed to help them draft a formal complaint to the city council. She also suggested contacting local advocacy groups that specialized in property rights and exposing corporate overreach. By the following morning, they were ready. Robert and Margaret drove to the city council office with a printed dossier of their findings. The receptionist directed them to a clerk who listened intently as they explained the situation. "This is serious," the clerk remarked, flipping through the dossier. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a property dispute. It's a legal and ethical violation." "I'll ensure this gets to the appropriate authorities," the clerk assured them. For the first time in days, Robert and Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. But their relief was short-lived. Upon returning home that evening, they found their backyard in disarray. The half-installed fence had been reinforced with additional metal panels, and a large black box had been mounted on one of the posts. It hummed faintly, its purpose unknown but undeniably ominous. More concerning was the group of men standing in their yard, drilling stakes into the ground as if the Bennetts didn't exist. Robert stormed out of the house, his anger surging. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" he shouted. One of the men turned to him, his expression blank and unflinching. "We're authorized to complete the installation. Please stay back." "This is my property," Robert yelled. "You have no right to be here." The man stepped closer, his tone calm but menacing. "This is part of a community safety initiative. Any interference will result in consequences." Robert clenched his fists, his blood pounding in his ears. But before he could respond, Margaret appeared at his side, holding her phone. "I'm recording this," she declared loudly, her voice steady despite the tension. "You're trespassing on private property. Leave now or we'll call the police." The men hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. One of them spoke into his earpiece, his voice too low to hear. A moment later, they began packing up their equipment. "This isn't over," the man said, before turning and walking away. Robert and Margaret watched in silence as the workers disappeared down the street. Once they were gone, Margaret let out a shaky breath. "They're testing us," she observed, "seeing how far they can push before we break." Robert responded grimly, "Well, they're about to find out we don't break." That night, they sent the footage to Helen, who promised to add it to their complaint. They also contacted the advocacy group Helen had recommended, which offered to help amplify their story. But Sentinel wasn't finished. The next morning, Robert woke to find a legal notice taped to their front door. It was from the HOA, alleging that the Bennetts had violated community regulations by obstructing an authorized project. The notice included a fine of $10,000 and a warning that further noncompliance could result in legal action, including foreclosure. "They're trying to bleed us dry," Margaret said, her voice trembling with anger. "They're trying to scare us," Robert corrected her. "But it's not going to work. If anything, this just proves we're getting to them." And they spent the rest of the day intensifying their efforts. Robert drafted a public statement detailing Sentinel and the HOA's actions, while Margaret reached out to more neighbors, hoping to garner support. Most were hesitant to get involved, but a few shared stories of their own unexplained fines, sudden rule changes, and mysterious construction projects that seemed to benefit no one but the HOA. That evening, they received a call from Helen. "I have good news and bad news," she said. "The good news is that the City Council is taking your complaint seriously. They're scheduling a hearing to review the HOA's actions." "And the bad news?" Robert asked. "The HOA and Sentinel aren't going to take this lying down," Helen replied. "They've already hired a high-powered legal team to defend their actions. This is going to get messy." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We're ready for messy." The hearing was set for the following week. Until then, Robert and Margaret braced themselves for whatever Sentinel and the HOA might throw their way. They knew the fight was far from over, but they also understood they couldn't afford to retreat. As the sun set over their backyard, they stood together, staring at the looming fence and the humming black box that now dominated their once peaceful yard. "They think they've already won," Robert said. Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. "They're wrong. The battle lines were drawn, and the Bennetts were prepared to fight. On the day of the hearing, Robert and Margaret arrived early, the air thick with anticipation. They had spent the week preparing relentlessly, working with Helen to organize their evidence and refine their argument. The city council chambers were filled with people, including a surprising number of neighbors. Some were there to support the Bennetts, inspired by their courage, while others seemed more curious than anything else. At the far end of the room, Eleanor Thompson sat with two sharply dressed lawyers flanking her. Sentinel's representatives, dressed in similarly tailored suits, exuded cold confidence. Robert's heart pounded as the proceedings commenced. Helen took the lead, presenting their case methodically and with precision. She outlined the illegal actions taken by the HOA, starting with the unauthorized installation of the fence and escalating to the fines, threats, and surveillance equipment. Photos and videos were displayed on a screen for all to see, each image painting a damning picture of overreach and coercion. The Bennett's property rights have been blatantly violated, Helen asserted, her voice clear and firm. The HOA, in partnership with Sentinel Protective Services, has employed fear and intimidation to pursue an agenda that benefits no one but themselves and their corporate backers. This is not about safety, it's about control. Eleanor's lawyers attempted to counter, arguing that the HOA had acted within its authority to ensure community safety. They cited vague clauses in the HOA charter and referenced non-existent security threats, but their arguments lacked substance. When pressed for specifics about the supposed threats or the purpose of the surveillance equipment, they faltered. The turning point came when Helen presented a contract she had uncovered, a deal between Sentinel and a private development company planning to purchase land in the neighborhood. The document explicitly outlined plans to devalue the area through strategic interventions, a euphemism for the exact tactics Sentinel and the HOA had employed. "This isn't about safety," Helen declared, holding the contract aloft. "This is a calculated scheme to force homeowners out of their properties and sell their land to the highest bidder. And the Bennetts aren't the only victims." The room erupted in murmurs, and Robert could see some of the more skeptical neighbors exchanging concerned glances. The council members whispered among themselves before calling for order. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. Her lawyers scrambled to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. When one council member directly asked her if she had approved the contract, she hesitated a moment too long before stammering, I was acting in the best interest of the community." The council wasn't convinced. After several hours of deliberation, they announced their decision. The fence and all associated equipment were to be removed immediately. The HOA was fined for violating property rights, and the contract with Sentinel was declared null and void. Furthermore, an investigation was launched into the HOA's practices, with Eleanor Thompson temporarily suspended from her position pending its outcome. As the decision was read aloud, a wave of relief washed over Robert and Margaret. They exchanged a glance, their exhaustion momentarily giving way to quiet triumph. In the weeks that followed, the fence was dismantled, the surveillance equipment was removed, and the black box disappeared without explanation. Robert and Margaret worked diligently to restore their backyard, planting new flowers and repairing the damage left by the ordeal. Neighbors began to visit more frequently, offering apologies for their earlier silence and expressing gratitude for the Bennett's persistence. A few even joined forces to advocate for a complete overhaul of the HOA, determined to ensure that something like this could never happen again. One crisp afternoon, as Robert and Margaret sat on their newly rebuilt deck, sipping coffee and watching the sun set over their yard, they reflected on everything they had endured. "We almost lost everything," Margaret said softly, breaking the silence. "But we didn't," Robert replied, taking her hand, "because we didn't back down." Margaret smiled faintly, her gaze sweeping across the yard. "It feels different now, like it's truly ours again." Robert nodded, squeezing her hand. "It always was, and it always will be." As the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon, the Bennetts knew that their fight had been worthwhile. Not just for their home, but for the principle that no one, regardless of their power, had the right to take it from them. They had stood their ground, and they had prevailed.